Okay, so I'm going to start with the most straightforward question I got just off the bat. This was from Rob. Is it okay if I tell people who I don't? None of the questions were especially I mean, some of them are intense, but they're not like, I don't know. But yeah, Rob had the most straightforward question. He asked, what are one or two books that are the best for understanding the history of the Bible? And of course there's so many possibilities, but I'll narrow it down for the Old Testament. I would say this is the author. I'm going to be using this book a lot this summer, the Wisdom Books by Robert Alter. So this isn't the book I'm talking about, but it is the author. Robert Alter is a prolific scholar of the Old Testament, and he wrote two very influential books, one called The Art of Biblical Narrative and one called The Literary Guide to the Bible. And Robert Alter, like everything he writes, is pretty incredible. So that's who I would go to for Old Testament. For New Testament, I would do Helmut Kester, the Introduction to the New Testament. This is Volume 2, History and Literature of Early Christianity. He is died now, but he was an emeritus professor when I was at Harvard. And not to speak ill of the dead, but I was warned. I didn't take his class, but I was warned. They said, if you go to his class during the shopping period and you can stay awake, then sure, take it. So he wasn't maybe the most engaging professor, but he did write some of the most probably influential and scholarly works on early Christian literature and history. Yes.
Can you just spell his last name?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Title?
Yeah, so his name is Helmut, Helmut. The last name is Kester, Koester. He's German. Koe, yes.
And the title?
Introduction to the New Testament. There's volumes 1 and 2. This is volume 2, History and Lit of Early Christianity. There's also, there's an Africana Bible. There's Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenzo, who writes from a feminist perspective, exegetical stuff. So if anyone has any, wants any recommendations of those more kind of specific interpretations, then let me know. But of course, I could go on and on about all these scholarly texts. The one last one that I cannot vouch for personally, but I just did some research because I feel like this is maybe more along the lines of what you were looking for. It came out, I think it was 2021, so pretty recent, from Harvard University Press. It has a lot of good reviews, called The Making of the Bible by Conrad Schmidt and Jens Schroeter. And this is really about like the compiling of the Bible and how it went from like fragments to like the sacred text that we know today. And again, I haven't read that one, but it seems like it's pretty universally acclaimed and might be like the way to go if that's what you're looking for.
What was the author's name on that one?
Yep, Conrad Schmidt. That's Conrad with a K, and Schmidt is Schmid, and Jens, that's Jens, Schroeter, Schroter. And that's The Making of the Bible. So those are my answers for question 1. And then Al sent me 3 questions. And I did my best to answer all of them. So first one is, why do we not do Bible readings during services other than the passage from the lectionary? That's the focus of the sermon, such as from the Old Testament, Psalms, letters to Paul, others. So some churches and some pastors do 2 at a time. I grew up with my church doing that, and then I don't know, at some point they just went to 1, and the church where I was a student minister went to 1, and so I just kind of got in the habit of picking 1 and doing a deep dive and preaching on that one. But something I do want to start doing more, and maybe I'm thinking I might do it next maybe after the summer, is incorporating the corresponding psalms for the week that come with the lectionary, because that is just, it's just nice to have some poetry in there in addition to the scripture. I have been incorporating the psalms in dinner churches. I take whatever psalm is for that week, and that's the one I've been doing for dinner churches. But of course, that's only once a month for like half the year. So that's something I really want to start doing. But yeah, I think it's mostly I just kind of got in the habit of focusing on one a week. And I usually, for continuity's sake, I try my best to do a whole series on something. So for Lent, I did all the Lucan ones, just so we have kind of a common thread we're going with. A couple summers ago, I did all of the Samuel passages that were in there, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and that was a challenge. Admittedly, the Old Testament stuff is less in my comfort zone than the New Testament stuff, but I try to do it. But then, I try to do things out of my comfort zone, but sometimes I got to do what's speaking to me at the time. And then I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be using this Robert Alter book a lot this summer, and that's because I decided I'm going to do a summer sermon series on the Proverbs. Because I just think it'll be fun. Some of them are very strange. Some of them are very wise. And the first chunk of it they're not even Proverbs. It's sort of a story about wisdom. And it's, and that's something, Proverbs aren't generally choices in the lectionary. So these summer sermon series kind of give me a chance to branch out and do some stuff.
Does everyone know about the lectionary?
Yeah, so the Common Lectionary was something, thank you, Pat. It was, it's actually pretty new. The revised one is new. It was implemented in 1994. And what they do, they go through cycles of 3 years, years A, B, and C. And every Sunday, they give you 4 or 5 passages to choose from. And like I said, sometimes people choose 2 passages, usually an Old and a New Testament passage. But there's always a gospel passage, an epistle, an Old Testament passage, and a psalm, generally speaking. And the idea is you just get this good mix variety to choose from. It doesn't encompass all of the Bible, the lectionary, but it's a solid chunk of it. We are on. And in case anyone's curious, we're in year C right now, right in the middle of year C. Yes, Corey.
And it has commentary too, so that if anybody really gets involved and interested in a particular
Yes.
series, you can do a little bit of research and they'll send you one.
Yes, yeah, it's true. So yeah, because a bunch of different scholars from all these different denominations came together to make this common lectionary, you can go to, I believe it's the Archdiocese of Montreal. They have a good series on it. I usually use Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt Library has all the common lectionary passages. Yeah. And a lot of people, you don't have to use the common lectionary. I just get overwhelmed by just choosing anything in the Bible. It seems it's a lot in there. So it's nice to be able to kind of pinpoint what I'm going to be preaching on, and also have kind of a series going at different times of the year. So, but I'm excited about this Proverbs this summer. I think it'll be fun. All right, Is that answer okay, Al?
Yeah.
Okay. And the next question, I actually, Al and Jan sent me a very, very similar question. So it's why, so how do we deal with differences in the Bible that conflict with each other? Do we accept them? Can we seek to reconcile them? Jan asked something very similar, and also included are one of the best and most confusing things about the Bible, that not only these versions can be interpreted differently, and that the entire Bible can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to start answering this by reading a chunk from from what the UCC says, our denomination says about reading the Bible, because I really like the way they articulate this. We take the Bible seriously, but not literally. In our tradition, we take it so seriously that we take the time to study the social and historical contexts in which it was written. So you hear about the history of the Jewish and Christian people, as well as the work of modern scholars. We believe that God intentionally planted the word in the middle of history and culture, and therefore the background is part of the story that we need to learn. We believe in the Bible so much that we think it deserves our best questions. We believe that the Bible is the opening of a conversation in which God is still speaking. We do not think the Bible will shrivel up and die because we dare to question why it says what it does. We believe that the Bible has withstood similar questions for thousands of years, and that in asking these questions together in communities of faith over time, we are part of a life-changing conversation that will go on forever. I think that is beautiful, personally. So yeah, I think that just really speaks to the fact that, this was the way we tend to look at it in our denomination, that it was divinely inspired, but written and compiled by human hands. And on a personal level, I think regardless of inconsistencies and contradictions, we can take something from just about any biblical lesson. I don't think we necessarily need to reconcile, when something contradicts something else. I think it's enough to, look at that context in the background and say, under this circumstance, this person was writing under these circumstances, and that's probably why they wrote what he wrote. And, and a good example of this is just a couple weeks ago, I preached on the very end of the Gospel of John. It's widely accepted that this final chapter was probably added to John very much later by a different author. And specifically someone who probably had like a pro-Peter agenda. It doesn't really match the rest of the narrative, but that doesn't mean, we should just disregard it. Because when I preached on that, we learned something about forgiveness, about Jesus' really like unconditional and all-loving forgiveness. And it ended up being a beautiful lesson in spite of kind of the strange circumstances under which it was written. And I think to the question of it being kind of one of the best confusing things about the Bible, that we can interpret these things in all these different ways, I think that's exactly it. It's amazing, and it's also confusing, and can unfortunately be dangerous when people will use an interpretation to harm others. But it is also the best thing about the Bible, because the same passage can say something to you one year and a completely different thing to you another year, and both those things can be life-changing and inspiring. We just have to make sure that what they're telling us isn't something that would cause us to harm other people or ourselves, or judge other people in a negative light. We have to make sure they do fall in line with our values and Christ's, doctrine of love. So that's my answer for that one. Hope that's okay. And the next one is always a dicey one. But it is, what is the role of the church in dealing with the U.S. political processes that seem to be failing us? Leaders, as well as individuals, can't seem to work things out, but rather become more divided. Should the church become more involved, or does everything fall on individual Christians? So I think we, as Christians and as a faith community, we have a command to do the work of Jesus. That was the call of the apostles at the time of Jesus' ascension, and then the apostles call on us to continue their work. And I think to answer this question, I want to look at two faith leaders who really took it upon themselves to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of get involved in politics in a way. And that would be, the first would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the other would be, Martin Luther King Jr., both men of faith who used their call from Jesus to work to stop oppression and violence that they saw happening in their respective countries. For Bonhoeffer, it was standing against the Nazis in helping to found the Confessing Church in resistance to the Nazis' state-sponsored German Christian church. And he, actively plotted against the Nazis and really did everything in his power to try to stop the rise of fascism. And he was killed by the Nazis right before the end of the war, unfortunately. For King, it was preaching and protesting and being righteously inspired by the liberating love of Christ, protesting and preaching against the further oppression and exploitation of black folks, and eventually against the oppression of poor folks of all walks of life. And the fact that both these men died for what they fought for is telling. That's how threatening they were to those in power. That's how scary their work of love and compassion was to the fascist and racist governments they were up against. So as far as the church kind of becoming more involved as a whole or individual Christians, we're stronger as one entity under Christ's doctrine of love. Being united in any way, is always easier than doing things alone. But being united it's kind of hard these days. And, King and Bonhoeffer in their work, they did their best to create coalitions. They were both successful to some extent. King probably more so than Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was against an entire Nazi regime. So the circumstances were a little different. But, King at the time of his assassination was working on the coalition for his, at the time, newly founded Poor People's Campaign, trying to unite poor folks of all walks of life and all races. And that Poor People's Campaign is still going on today. And in fact, their current leader, the Reverend William Barber, he was just arrested a couple weeks ago at the Capitol at the Rotunda for praying. For laws that would help poor folks, that would help people who are struggling. Praying against the bill that's going through to cut Medicaid and food stamps and all that. That's his call, because those are the things that help the people Jesus calls us to help. So ultimately, I think we need to take a long, hard look as what we as Christians are called to do, to love the widow, the child, the alien. We're called to treat all people with compassion and love our enemies. And we need to take those values of love and put them to use in the public sphere. And it's sad to me that things like loving the immigrant and feeding the poor are looked upon as political now. I think that's kind of where we run into a lot of these problems, that everything is politicized, but ultimately these were things Jesus commanded us to do. And not getting involved in helping the poor or welcoming the immigrant is directly antithetical to Jesus's work. I could go on about this forever, but I'll end it with a really perfect quote by Walter Rauschenbusch, who was the founder of the social gospel, which came about in the early 20th century, kind of in response to, we're kind of in a new Gilded Age now, and his social gospel commentary was in response to the Gilded Age then. And he says, whoever uncouples the religious and social life has not understood Jesus. Whoever sets any bounds for the reconstructive power of the religious life over the social relations of institutions of humankind, to that extent denies the faith of God.
Amy,
Yes.
just a quick, not even a comment, but a book suggestion. There's a wonderful book on this subject of how should churches get involved in these kinds of political issues. The author's name is Jim Wallis, and it's an unusual spelling. It's Wallis. He was the founder of Sojourners, the social action group. And the book is called God's Politics.
God's Politics.
Yeah,
I've heard of that now.
It's terrific, and I highly recommend it.
Awesome. Thank you. So, God's Politics by Jim Wallis. Thank you.
Sure.
So, does anyone, any follow-ups to that? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Well, I really like looking at what the UCC emails say and the Vermont Conference emails, and just, I feel like it's all in really good perspective about dealing with current situations.
Yeah. If you're not on the United Church of Christ, mailing lists, they do have really lovely daily devotionals and prayers and really, tactful and lovely, essays, letters. It's worth signing up to get those. It's national. You can get them. It's a national, our denomination, yeah. And then there is a state one too from the Vermont UCC specifically, yeah. And those come weekly.
And how does one get them?
You would go to the website and sign up to get mailings. Yeah, I'll put links to do that in the Thursday emails.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next question is from Cindy. When I was growing up in a UCC church, I never heard about the second coming of Christ. So when I did first learn about it around college, I was surprised. I know we've come across it in Bible study and readings. What does the UCC actually say about it? Is there a specific UCC belief related to this? Are there parts of the Bible interpreted in different ways, even within the UCC? So one of the nice things about the UCC, yeah.
I could not hear, you were talking quickly.
Yeah, it was. So it's
What is the subject?
The subject is about the second coming of Christ, and that we maybe don't hear much about it in our local UCC churches. And does the UCC specifically kind of have any guidance on it or say anything about it? So one of the nice things about the UCC is that it's very bottom up. We don't have, we don't have a pope. We don't have any kind of bishops, and we do have a national office that offers guidance. But ultimately, we are congregational, and that's nice. But it also means there's no real exhaustive history on the theology, on our theology. We came together about 4 different denominations in the 50s. So we're kind of a mishmash of these different Protestant faiths. So every congregation, every region is different, down to every little congregation can be different. So it's kind of hard to say. So I can only speculate on this. And I can only assume that in New England, because I didn't grow up hearing much about this anyway, that in this area, because Cindy, you were in Connecticut, correct? Yeah. I think the second coming of Christ has a lot of unfortunate connotations with stuff like the rapture and, Revelation and all these scary apocalyptic things, especially since around 2012 when people were really had apocalypse on the mind, on the brain, and the rapture books were gaining a lot of popularity. And I think it's something that's so kind of hard to stomach, especially for kind of more educated, more middle class people, generally speaking. I kind of think my assumption is that sort of went out of fashion. People, they didn't want to touch it, which I get. I do get that. It's hard, but I think we're doing ourselves a disservice when we disregard certain texts just because they're kind of tough. And I think it goes back to the question about interpreting the Bible and its contradictions and some stuff in the Bible that's hard. I think there's, especially when you think about the context in which it's written, for instance, if you look at Paul's letters, half of Paul's letters are him trying to comfort these new Christian groups because they thought that the second coming was imminent. They were just sitting there waiting, and they were like, "What are we doing here? We thought paradise was going to happen now. We're doing everything right, and now we're sitting here getting persecuted, and the world's not ending the way we want it to. So a lot of people got burned, figuratively, when they predicted this imminent second coming. So it has a lot of. It's a tough thing. So now I think it's nice to look at it in a way that we should always be prepared. And I think it's crazy also that people ever tried to predict when it was going to come, because Jesus himself says multiple times, I don't even know when it's going to happen. The only person who knows it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, is God. So the idea is just always I think there's something really nice and beautiful to be said for always being prepared, not in like a paranoid way, but in a way, I always want to be doing what I'm called to do on this earth. And I want to make an earth worthy of Jesus' second coming. That's the way I look at it. That's what helps me with it. So ultimately, no, the UCC doesn't say anything specific, but I think it goes along with how the UCC and how I look at the Bible, in that we do take it seriously and we want to talk about what they said about Christ coming back and why and how, and sometimes it seems like they're talking like it's going to happen really soon, and sometimes they're saying, no, wait, be patient. I don't know. They just wanted it to happen so bad. It was tough times. So yeah, that got a little jumbled, but how was that? Is that okay? All right. Now that Tom gave me the toughest one.
He's waiting here.
Okay. Save the best for last. Tom writes, do I have free will, or are my actions already determined by God's will or God's plan? So this is like this ultimate question of not just Christianity, but like religion. But especially in our denomination, because we, not necessarily UCC, but our roots are in Calvinism. So our roots are in sort of the father of predestination of John Calvin. So it is something that should be wrestled with. And I also, admittedly, I went to Chris for a little help with this one. And he pointed me to an early Middle Ages philosopher, Boethius, who helped me a lot. So, God sees all, God knows all. God sees all and knows all in a divine way that we could never comprehend, including seeing what kind of choices we will make, that we can and will change our minds because we do have free will. Boethius argues that humans are essentially good, but that the more we give into vice, the less free we become. And I've preached about this a little bit before. Sort of this idea, it sounds really contradictory, but this idea that, sort of when you submit to whatever kind of the will or the call of God is, that's when you actually become more free rather than, giving into like all pleasure, all vice all the time. And I think that could ring true, when it comes to things like addiction, you become essentially, it's this full circle thing where you free will so hard that you free will right into like a prison of your own making. And Boethius says by yielding and consenting to these passions, they worsen the slavery to which they have brought themselves and are, as it were, the captives of their own freedom. And I think this is increasingly true in our own society right now, especially in terms of like thinking about AI and how kind of dystopian things are lately. Because I think we like to think about these incredible technologies are all at our fingertips, right? And they're supposed to make us more efficient when things like AI, they're really just destroying our capacity to think critically. And we become slaves to this machine instead of thinking for ourselves and making decisions based on our own values and our own morals and our faith. Now, this idea of giving into vice or sin so completely that we're slaves to it, that we lose all our free will, that's not dissimilar from Calvin, who was, by way of Augustine, sort of the father of predestination. But he also believed that those who give wholly into vice, but he also believed that humans were not good at all. He believed that we were so corrupted by original sin that it was essentially impossible to freely choose to be righteous. I do not agree with that. So Calvin only believed that we have free will in that we're free to choose sin. Don't love that. Don't believe in that. But this analogy from Boethius helped me a little after I read it several times. So I'm just going to read it once for you guys, so sorry. I can send it to you if you want to read it over. But if a man sits down, the opinion that he is sitting must be true. And conversely, if the opinion that someone is sitting be true, then the person must necessarily be sitting. Therefore, there is necessity in both cases. The man must be sitting, and the opinion must be true. But the man is not sitting because the opinion is true. The opinion is true because the sitting came before the opinion about it. Therefore, even though the cause of truth came from one side, necessity is common to both. So, my understanding of that is that it's sort of a chicken or the egg thing, except that we accept that an initial truth comes from God, and then we have the will to go towards or away from that truth. Now, because Tom submitted this question, I have another passage from Boethius that I really liked. And Tom, one or two Ask the Pastors ago, asked me, he had a really lovely question about the power of prayer and, does God really hear our prayers? And Boethius actually ends the section about free will, about prayer. And it's kind of lovely. So I'm gonna end with this. The freedom of the human will remains inviolate, and laws are just since they provide rewards and punishments to human wills which are not controlled by necessity. Our hopes and prayers are not directed to God in vain, for if they are just, they cannot fail. Therefore, stand firm against vice and cultivate virtue. Lift up your soul to worthy hopes and offer humble prayers to heaven. If you will face it, the necessity of virtuous action imposed upon you is very great, since all your actions are done in the sight of a judge who sees all things.